Wow. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am so delighted to be able to join you virtually this year for this year's University of Maine at Augusta Convocation. I'd like to extend my thanks for the very generous invitation to join you all, but also commend each and every one of you for your fortitude in sticking with things this year. As the previous speakers have mentioned, this year has been one unlike any other, and I think we all hope that it will be one unlike any other to come. And in times of this nature, in times of outbreak, with both biological and social strife all around us, in some instances, it's easy to put important things in life on hold. But I want to commend all of the students for staying with their higher education during this very difficult time. I particularly want to commend all of the rising scholars, and especially the work that you all are doing and the path that you are forging is admirable, and I think it sets a pathway and a tone for all of us. So I'm really delighted to be able to join. Now, as I understand it, one of the themes for the upcoming academic year, of course, is going to be the concept of outbreak. And as we've heard, that concept has so many different forms and can be interpreted in a number of different ways. It speaks to the value of higher education about how a university can coalesce around a common theme and analyze it and understand its various different meanings and potential interpretations. The one that I'd like to focus on today is the first definition of outbreak that we heard earlier, which is a significant uptick in a number of infectious diseases in a particular area. And to do that, I'd like to focus on the book that I understand the campus is reading, which is the Ghost Map. I am delighted to hear that one of the organizing principles for the academic year will be to organize not just around the theme of outbreaks, but around the book itself. This is a book that I had the opportunity to read, and in a time like this, with so many changes, both biological and social, swarming around us, I can't think of a more important book to read right now as we wrap up 2020 and go into 2021 for an entire college, an entire campus to be reading, thinking about, and discussing. So I'd like to kick off that series of discussions today. And I'm delighted to be able to speak about this book, an important book that chronicles the way in which the entire world, or at the time, the City of London, dealt with another infectious disease threat, an outbreak of cholera that affected the City of London 166 years ago this month. Now, there is so much that can be said about this book, particularly along the ways in which it relates to the world that we find ourselves in today. One of the reasons that I enjoy this book so much is the manner in which it casts older problems in a contemporary light and asks us to think very hard about the problems of today through the lens and through the experience of 1854 London as they were contending with the cholera outbreak. And in particular, the book is meaningful because of the way it chronicles systematic errors that were made. And for me personally, prompts me to think about the ways in which we might still be making those errors. And fundamentally, it requires us to ask whether the tendencies that generated those errors are still with us. I could talk all afternoon about this book, but given that our time today is limited, I'd like to frame my comments into the way that we think about this book, and not just this book, but outbreaks in general, along three lines: the past, the present, and the future. So let's start with the past. One of the things that jumps out at me when you take a look at this book and read it carefully is the way that London's experience with cholera, specifically the 1854 outbreak, that was made so famous and chronicled in this book via John Snow's methodical epidemiological detective work. What's remarkable is the way in which this notable outbreak of 1854 was actually not the first major outbreak of cholera that London grappled with. Indeed, cholera only really arrived to London in 1831, 23 years before this large outbreak. But in the run-up to this particular instance in 1854, there were scores of smaller but equally significant cholera outbreaks that devastated London every so often. The question for us now, looking at the past, is why didn't any of those earlier outbreaks trigger the same sort of public concern and the impetus for change that the one in 1854 did? This is a question that we should think about as we think about our current state. All of the warning signs were there that the big one was coming. Why didn't the Londoners of 1830, 1854, of 1840, and the early 1850s heed any of those warning signs? I'm not going to go into that in detail today, although Johnson himself does in the book. The big question for us to think about as you're kicking things off and picking up your academic work or starting on that journey, the big question for us is, what does this failure to heed those warning signs tell us about our current time? What are the warning signs that are out there right now, all around us, that we may all see but aren't heeding? What will a historian 166 years from now write when she tells Maine's story? What's on the wall right now that we aren't seeing? Or what are we seeing but not acting upon? Each and every one of you should have ideas around that. That's the spark that creates social change. That's why you're in university settings. What are your ideas? What do you think are warning signs that we see and aren't following, or may not even see at all? Certainly, we should all, again, have ideas. Maybe it's climate change. Maybe it's a potential energy crisis. Maybe it's the reckoning that we've talked about with respect to systematic injustice along racial lines across this country. And of course, one of them that's on my mind is the continuing threat of pandemics like COVID-19, which we're all contending with. The warning signs that a pandemic in our contemporary state would arrive, as it did now in 2020, have been there for decades. Just like those smaller outbreaks in the run-up to the 1854 outbreak of cholera, there were signs across the globe that a large, systematic pandemic like the one that we are contending with now was only weeks, if not days away. Did we heed those signs? Did we do all that we could? And if we didn't, will we do better going forward? That's the past. Let's talk about the present. One of the themes of the Ghost Map is the debate between John Snow and the entire scientific community of the day, specifically around Snow's theory of how cholera is transmitted. In his view, it was transmitted by water. Now, we all know that Snow was right, but what's interesting is that at the time, he was roundly criticized and dismissed, in this case by an entire establishment of scientists who believed in what at the time was the prevailing notion of how cholera was transmitted, not through water, but through what they called the miasma. The idea that cholera was not a function of water, but of impure or foul air. The book chronicles how a well-formed committee, the Vestry Committee, examined all the evidence in favor of and against Dr. Snow's theory of waterborne transmission. And the Vestry Committee found in favor of Dr. Snow. They found that the weight of evidence, as they said, appears to be clearly and unmistakable in one direction. After this monumental report, the haze that was generated by the miasma theory should have been lifted. Indeed, after that report came out, for all intents and purposes, science had won over superstition. For good, it seemed. But one of the lessons of science and of history, and in particular of the 1854 cholera outbreak, is that science rarely lands such decisive blows. And the Broad Street outbreak of cholera was no exception. As is detailed in the book, within a few weeks of that blockbuster report being issued, vindicating Dr. Snow and his correct analysis of how cholera is transmitted and how that outbreak of cholera started, another team issued their own account of the outbreak and summarily dismissed Dr. Snow's hypothesis. Their vision, sadly, had been clouded by their unwavering belief in their own theory. They were, in short, blinded by their own idea, an idea that they fell in love with. One question for everyone to think about is whether there is anything so dangerous on this planet as an idea that the people who hold can't let go of. The episode that is chronicled in the Ghost Map, which Johnson characterizes so well, has important lessons for the present day. Namely, what is today's miasma theory? What is the minority viewpoint that's out there that we, all of us, routinely scoff at, but that eventually may be shown to be true? Now, again, our time today is limited, and certainly I think we could teach an entire class around minority viewpoints that won the day eventually, and majority viewpoints that eventually crumbled. But the question, the challenge for each of you is simple. What is your minority viewpoint that you believe will prevail over the majority's view? What's your big idea? And what are you going to do to make sure you don't throw away your shot at vindicating and proving your own big idea? What do you need to do in order to prove that idea? Well, the book itself lays out a roadmap. And fortunately, in this setting, one can follow in the same roadmap that Dr. Snow himself did. Frame the issue, marshal the evidence, advocate for your cause, and have the courage of the convictions that you have to stand up for what you believe in, especially in the face of those who will routinely and summarily dismiss you, as they did Dr. Snow. Now, the book goes into reasons why Dr. Snow's ideas were dismissed. They claim that he wasn't an expert in the matter. He was an anesthesiologist, not an expert in public health. They claim that his idea didn't make sense, even though they themselves didn't really grapple with what he was saying. Those factors and the tendency to dismiss what upstarts say in favor of ideas that we ourselves hold near and dear to ourselves is something that has repeated itself over and over and over. And it's most definitely something that each of you will face as you make your way through your education and then through your career. The question, the lesson, is not so much a question of whether you will face that opposition, because you will. The question is how you respond to it. Will you crumble in the face of those who claim that you are absolutely wrong and should not be listened to? Or will you stand up and make sure that you've got the evidence and the fortitude to face those challenges head on? The third thing I'd like to touch on today is the future. Talked about the past, talked about the present. Let's talk about the ways in which the cholera epidemic of 1854 tells us something about our own futures. One of the central characters, in fact, the central character of this book, is not Dr. Snow or Reverend Whitehead or the cholera bacteria itself, but rather the city of London as a whole. Given the interconnectedness of the sewer system, the water system, the crowded cities, and the emergence of a bacteria, it's no surprise that the city itself was the level at which the action was occurring. Now, if each of us, if any of us, were to time travel back to 1854 in London and describe for any of the Londoners what modern cities look like, people would have thought you were absolutely crazy. because in their minds, cities were terrible. They were places of disease and pestilence. No one in 1854 London could have potentially imagined that a modern city would be a place of relative safety and one where ideas could be generated and individuals could live in density and coexist. But as we think about COVID-19, and we think about the ways in which COVID-19 itself emerged in a large, urban, dense, highly populated city in central China, and used the features of that city, high traffic, high ingress and egress, to then multiply itself and spread not just through central China, not just across Asia, but now across the world. We have an opportunity to rethink what the role of the city will be in our future. Will we, as people in 1850s London thought, predict that cities are done? Is this the end of the city? Or will we, with the help of young scientists, young thinkers, young folks who believe in the power of social change, like each and every one of you, will we put into place systems and controls that allow cities to exist as they are, but in a manner that protects our global safety? That surely will be one of the defining challenges, at least from an outbreak perspective, for how we think about our future after we get through COVID-19. Now, there are so many different angles that we could talk about. And I hope that over the coming academic year, you have an opportunity not just to read this book, but to discuss it, debate it, and think about it, and most importantly, disagree about it with your peers. That is, after all, one of the best privileges of being in higher education right now. That opportunity to think about ideas, discuss them, debate them, and disagree with your peers. I hope I've provided you a little bit of fodder to kick off those discussions. I'd like to close by again thanking the entire University of Maine community for this very kind and generous invitation to join you all today. I wish you nothing but the best on your academic journey. As always, I ask everyone to please be kind and take care of one another. I look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you.
Dr. Shah, thank you for your amazing remarks for our convocation today. We are grateful that you were eager to join us to share your perspective and your expertise on our academic theme, and we invite you to come as a guest lecturer and teach that class on miasma theory here at UMA. I would also like to take a moment to thank the Convocation Committee for organizing today's event. Thank you to everyone for tuning in to kick off our 2020-2021 academic year. This concludes our convocation, and I leave you with a closing song, In These Times by Noel Paul Stookey.
There's a warning in the wind that comes wailing through the trees, a depression in the shoreline left by